January 9th, 2024, Ecuador. The city of Guayaquil, early afternoon. Inside the studio of TC Televisión, a live broadcast is underway. The presenters are at their desks, the cameras are rolling, half the country is watching. And suddenly, sounds from outside bleed into the broadcast, shouting, running. Then the studio door opens, and masked, armed men walk in. The cameras don't cut, the cameramen can't run, and millions of people watch, live on air, as their own country is taken hostage. The masked men force the presenters to the floor, point guns at the camera, and one of them shouts the sentence that will enter history. "Don't mess with the Mafia." In those same hours, across the city, people are being executed in the street. Police officers are being kidnapped. Bomb threats are pouring into hospitals. A country collapses in a single afternoon on live television. And that evening, a young president, Daniel Noboa, picks up a pen and signs a document most heads of state never have to sign in their lifetime. A decree of internal armed conflict. A formal declaration of war, but not against another state, against the organizations inside his own country. Now stop and ask yourself this question. Just 5 or 6 years earlier, this was one of the safest countries in Latin America. A quiet, calm country where tourists wandered without a care, where the murder rate rivaled European nations. Who burned this country down? The masked men who stormed that studio? No. They were only the last flames of the fire. And let me say this from the start, those men weren't Albanian either. Tonight, I'm not going to tell you about the men who carried out that raid. I'm going to tell you about one of the most powerful European customers of the global cocaine economy that raised them. And if you've been following this story, you already know that customer. Because in the last episode, I told you about the containers opened at the port of Antwerp, Europe's new cartel. Tonight, we go to the other end of that chain, to the lands where the cocaine is born, to the man who ran an entire supply chain from a prison cell. And take note of this, the manhunt for this man would end years later in a country nobody expected, Turkey. But we'll get there. Welcome back to Endless Night Files. If you watched the last episode, you'll remember it opened with a port operation. Containers, tons of cocaine, and at the end of the operation, unexpected names. Not Italians, not Colombians, Albanians. In that episode, we drew the map of Europe: Antwerp, Rotterdam, London. But to be honest with you, that map was incomplete, because Europe is only the delivery address of this story. The dock where the product is loaded, the port where the money turns, the real front line of the war, all of it lies on the other side of the ocean. And the move that set the Albanian networks apart from every rival on Earth was made exactly there. Everyone else bought the product in Europe, hand to hand, the price multiplying at every step. The Albanians, one day, asked a simple question: why are we paying middlemen? Why don't we buy the product at the source, at the producer's door? It sounds like an innocent question of commerce, but the answer changed the fate of a country. So let me tell you about that country, because the real main character of tonight's story is not a man, it's a geography. Ecuador. Look at the map. A small country, but look at its neighbors. Colombia to the north, Peru to the south, squeezed right between the two biggest cocaine producers in the world. Ecuador itself produces almost no cocaine. It doesn't need to, because fate gave it something more valuable than production: location. For the producers, Ecuador is the natural doorway through which the product opens to the world. But location alone is not enough. The lock on that door has to be broken too. And in Ecuador, 3 things broke the lock. First, in 2009, the American airbase in the region was closed, and that closure opened a serious debate about a gap in surveillance over the coastline and the ocean. Oversight was no longer as tight as it used to be. Second, Ecuador's currency is the American dollar. For dirty money, there is no better news. You don't even need to convert what you earn. It's accepted everywhere on Earth. Third, corruption. Fake IDs, fake passports, fake export papers. If you go to the right door with the right envelope, all of it can be arranged. And on top of these three comes my favorite detail of the whole story. Do you know the most innocent product Ecuador sells to the world? Bananas. One of the biggest banana exporters on the planet. Every day, hundreds of containers of bananas leave the port of Guayaquil for every corner of the world, most of all for Europe. Now think, hundreds of refrigerated containers leaving every single day, tons of fruit in every one of them. Physically searching every single one at customs is impossible. The ships carrying cocaine to Europe, they are those banana ships. Remember the containers opened in Antwerp in the last episode? Guess what was written on most of them? Bananas. The fruit on your breakfast table and Europe's cocaine were traveling on the same ship, side by side. This was the treasure the Albanian networks discovered: an unwatched port, a dollarized economy, a bureaucracy that could be bought, and the most innocent cargo traffic in the world. The only thing missing was an architect to build the machine. And that architect had already arrived in Ecuador in 2014, in handcuffs. But to understand that architect, we first need a brief look at the factory that produced him. Albania in the 90s, a country freshly out of 45 years of closed, paranoid rule. And in 1997, it suffered a pyramid scheme catastrophe. The schemes people had poured their life savings into collapsed one after another. The country rose up, the state fell apart. And in that chaos, the army's weapons depots were looted. A people who had lost their money, a street that had armed itself, and across the water, a few hours away by boat, a wealthy continent. In those years, the most valuable thing Albania exported was a desperate, fearless generation. Most of them built honest lives in Europe, but a minority used the two assets they had brought from home, having nothing left to lose, and that steel clan loyalty I told you about in part 1. Besa. The main character of tonight's story climbed out of the very middle of that wreckage. A man born in Vlora on Albania's Adriatic coast. Vlora. In the 90s, both one of the flashpoints of the pyramid scandal and one of the departure ports for the smuggling boats heading to Europe. Like thousands of young men who grew up in that chaos, Dritan Rexhepi found his path in the underworld. According to the allegations, he worked as a hired gunman in that period. In 1998, he entered the case file of a double killing. Both victims were police officers, and years later, a court in Tirana would sentence him, in absentia, to 25 years for those murders. In absentia, because Rexhepi was nowhere to be found. In 2006, while in custody, he simply walked out of a police building, taking advantage of negligence, as a prosecutor would bitterly summarize years later. And that day, one of the most extraordinary escape careers in the history of crime began. In 2008, he was caught in the Netherlands, extradited to Italy to stand trial for cocaine trafficking, and convicted. In 2011, he escaped from an Italian prison by tying bedsheets together and climbing out of a window. He was caught, and this time landed in Belgium, where he had an armed robbery file waiting. In 2012, in Belgium, he escaped again, by jumping over a fence. 3 countries, 3 escapes, and years later, the European press would make a comparison about this man that you should write down. By their reckoning, Dritan Rexhepi had escaped from prison more times than El Chapo. El Chapo, the world-famous boss who dug tunnels and fed an army. And after his 2012 escape, Rexhepi understood that Europe had become too small for him. He crossed the ocean. but not to where everyone else went. Not Colombia, not Mexico. He went to that quiet door nobody had spotted on the map yet, Ecuador. In Guayaquil, he built a new life on false identities. The records held a Greek name and 2 separate Albanian names. And in August 2014, when an international operation caught him in Ecuador, everyone thought the story was over. He was sentenced to 13 years for cocaine trafficking and put in a cell. The escape artist was finally in a cage. But here is the real strangeness of this story. Dritan Rexhepi's empire was not built before that arrest. It was built after it. Now, remember something. We have seen empires run from behind walls before. In our Mafia file, you watched Ridwan Taghi direct a continent's bloodshed from behind the curtains of a Dubai villa. It is the state's oldest fear about organized crime, that the bars change only the address, not the sentence. Italy, because of that fear, invented one of the harshest isolation regimes in the world for mafia bosses. No phone, no contact, even letters are monitored. Now let me tell you the Ecuadorian version of that same fear. In Ecuador's prisons, there was no isolation regime. In Ecuador's prisons, according to the allegations, money bought whatever it wanted. Phones, cash, protection, even weapons. And the most important item that entered Rexhepi's cell was a telephone. According to the picture Italian prosecutors would piece together years later, that cell was not a place of punishment, it was a headquarters. According to findings entered into court records, in March of 2016, Rexhepi was personally negotiating a 300-kilogram cocaine shipment by phone with his trusted representative in Europe. 300 kilos from a cell by phone, like an estate agent selling an apartment. And this was not a one-off performance, it was the system itself. According to Italian prosecutors, Rexhepi ruled from behind the bars as the undisputed boss of a structure called Kompania Bello. Understand what Kompania Bello is, because this structure is an evolutionary step in the history of organized crime. Not a single family, not a single clan, a federation of 14 separate Albanian crime groups. Each group has its own role, its own territory, its own share of the profit, but the supply flows from a single center. When Europol examined this structure, it described the real revolution like this. For 100 years, the rule of the cocaine trade was division of labor. The importer separate, the wholesaler separate, the street dealer separate. Everyone holds one link of the chain, and the price multiplies every time the product changes hands. Kompania Bello threw that model in the bin. They bought the product at the producer's door in South America, carried it on their own routes, brought it in through their own ports, distributed it through their own networks. From the field to the nose, the entire chain in one hand. In the language of economics, vertical integration. No middlemen, no commission, costs no one else could get down to. The trade Europe's old organizations ran through layer upon layer of middlemen. The Albanian networks turned into a far shorter, far more direct chain. And the numbers show what this model produced. Estimated revenue? $140 million in 2 years, from one cell. One of the claims that reached the European press. In a fruit container bound for Britain, £20 million worth of cocaine went missing. And according to the claim, Rexhepi's reaction was not panic. From his cell, he investigated the fate of the load, directed his suspicion at a rival name, and life went on. For this man, £20 million was not a disaster shaking an empire, it was a logistics hiccup, tracked from a cell. The next ship was already on its way. Stop here for a second and see the absurdity of the picture. On one side, the best equipped police forces in Europe, a joint investigation running across 10 countries. On the other, a man officially convicted, officially in the hands of the system. And that man, from a building under state supervision, is running one of the most important actors in the multi-ton cocaine shipments heading to Europe. The picture should feel familiar. Pablo Escobar built his own prison, La Catedral. The Cali brothers kept running their business from their cells. But Rexhepi's difference is this: He didn't buy the prison, he became invisible inside it. No luxury, no jacuzzi, just a telephone and one of the most disciplined supply chains in the world. This is the signature of the new generation. The old bosses ruled by showing their power, the new ones rule by seeming not to exist. By the way, if this is why you're here, how these networks actually work, consider subscribing. Now, back to Guayaquil. And here we see that golden rule from the last episode playing out on the ground in Ecuador. What did we say made the Albanian networks Europe's favorite partner? They work with everyone, and they try to replace no one. In Guayaquil, the formula was the same. The Albanians were not alone in that city. Mexico's giant cartels used the same port. Colombian organizations were there too, and all of them worked with the local gangs. According to military intelligence assessments, the number of gangs in the city had gone from 10 to 20, and those 20 structures were tearing each other apart for supremacy. In an arena like that, what is the smartest strategy? Stay out of the fight for the throne. In Guayaquil, the Albanians took territory from no one, tore down no one's sign, declared war on no one. They simply held the one thing everyone needed, the door to Europe. The Mexicans were looking at the American market. The Albanians' route was the other side of the Atlantic. No overlap, no conflict. The local gangs were the muscle, the Albanians were the customer. A good-paying, trouble-free, quiet customer. In a city where everyone was at war, being the side that traded with everyone, that was real power. Where the guns talked, they talked freight. So what happened to the country this machine ran in? This is the darkest act of this video. Because cocaine does not enrich the places it passes through, cocaine burns the places it passes through. The Albanian networks had built a clever model in Ecuador. They themselves were invisible on the street. In Guayaquil, they lived quiet lives under false identities and handed the dirty work to local partners. Storing the product, moving it to the port, loading it into containers, securing the dock, all of it was the local gang's job. And as those local gangs fed on the millions of this trade and grew into giants, they went to war with each other. Who owns the port? Who owns the warehouse district? Which gang holds which dock? Let me give you the numbers, because these numbers are the collapse graph of a country. In 2018, Ecuador's murder rate was 6 per 100,000, European levels among the safest in Latin America. In 2023, that same number reached 47, and the 2025 figures show the record broken again, the rate passing 50. More than 8 times higher in 7 years. Duran, the port town right next to Guayaquil, entered the statistics as one of the deadliest places on Earth, at 145 per 100,000. And the place where this collapse showed most clearly was the prisons. In prisons that belonged to the state on paper, in practice, every cell block was a gang's headquarters. In the riots, the blocks became battlefields. The system that let Rexhepi run an empire from a cell was not the exception, it was the rule. And the fuse of that doomsday at the start of this video was lit exactly here. In those January days of 2024, the news that set the country on fire was, according to the allegations, the disappearance of one of the country's most powerful gang leaders from his cell in a maximum security prison. When the guards entered the cell, it was empty. As news of that empty cell spread, simultaneous riots erupted in the prisons, and those masked men stormed into the live studio. A photograph of a state's collapse, a country where even the most protected room of its most protected building is no longer clearly in anyone's hands. Meanwhile, Europe's share of the cocaine exploded too. In 2021, a third of the cocaine seized by Ecuadorian police was on the Europe route. Just 2 years earlier, that share had been below 10%. That rise showed how fast Ecuador was being wired into Europe's cocaine market, and the Albanian networks were among the most effective buyers on that growing corridor. the Albanians were not untouchable either. Over the last decade, at least 6 Albanians were executed in underworld reckonings in Guayaquil. According to the allegations, the price of going independent inside the organization was the same. The fate of those who tried to export cocaine on their own, without the Kompania's approval, became the message to everyone else. Picture a country, a calm Pacific nation living off bananas and tourism. 10 years later, the same country, its army in the streets, its prisons at war, its president signing a war decree. The men who raided that studio at the start of this video were not Albanian. They were the local gangs this trade had swollen. But when you look at the most profitable line of the economy feeding those gangs with millions, the lines keep tracing back to the same route, those banana ships leaving the Guayaquil docks for Antwerp. So where was all the money this machine produced going? Because Ecuador was not the only country being transformed. At the other end of the chain, Albania itself was changing shape. Some European publications and opposition circles began using a heavy, contested label for the country: narco state. Look at the cranes on Tirana's skyline today, at the residence towers. Let's be clear. Most of those towers are the product of legitimate growth. Equating an entire construction sector with crime would be unjust. The cocaine is loaded in Ecuador, unloaded in Antwerp, sold in London, and part of the money, according to the allegations, turns into concrete on the Adriatic coast. 2 faces of the same trade. And in the ocean between them, every day, the banana ships. And right at this point, on the other side of the ocean, something happened that nobody expected. In the spring of 2020, Europe's underworld was talking as it always had. Shipments, addresses, prices, reckonings, all of it flowing through encrypted phones that were said to be unbreakable. The underworld trusted these devices so completely that things which for decades had not been said even in whispers on the street were now being typed out on keyboards. But there was something they didn't know. They were no longer alone. European police had taken over one of those networks, EncroChat, from the inside. A British official's description captures the scale of it in a single sentence. It was like having a man inside every major crime group in the country. For months, police read millions of messages in real time. And in the summer of 2020, when the network was brought down and the wave of raids began, the tally entered history. More than 700 arrests across Europe in the first wave, tons of drugs, tens of millions of pounds in cash. For our story, what mattered most was the pattern emerging in the British investigation files as the messages were decoded. In Britain's cocaine wholesale trade, they kept running into Albanian networks, again and again. The silent rise I told you about in Part 1 was no longer an estimate. It was documented in millions of messages, kilo by kilo, pound by pound. The full story of that collapse deserves a night of its own, and I will tell that night separately later. But let me make one thing clear. The operation I'm about to describe is not a continuation of EncroChat. Los Blancos was the result of a completely separate investigation that had been running for years. I'm not drawing a direct link between the two. But the calendar showed the same year, and for the underworld, the message was one and the same. The states were coming from everywhere, all at once. In September of that same year, the hammer came down on the real target. In the operation named Los Blancos, police broke down doors at the same dawn in 10 countries, stretching from Europe to the Middle East. The target? Kompania Bello. 20 key names were arrested in a single night, and this was the final move of a siege that had lasted years. More than 84 people from the same network had already been caught over the previous 5 years. Europol announced the operation as the biggest blow ever struck against Albanian organized crime. The empire of the man in the cell stood naked on the screens, and everyone thought the same thing. It's over. The Federation dismantled, the boss already in prison, the boss closing. everyone was wrong, because the most unbelievable chapter of this story had not even begun. In 2021, in Ecuador, a process began that no one has ever fully explained. Dritan Rexhepi, a man with case files in 4 countries, the target of a massive international operation, was first moved to house arrest. In the words that appear in investigative reports, through questionable legal procedures. Then, according to the allegations, that status was loosened step by step. House arrest became a routine obligation to show up and sign a register. And according to the finding of Insight Crime, the international crime research organization, the process amounted, in effect, to this. Ecuador's prison system had quietly set free one of Europe's most notorious cocaine bosses. No press conference, no announcement. The world realized Rexhepi was no longer inside only months later. So late that while a respected international outlet was still publishing content about the boss in prison, the man was already out. The question Ecuador's press and prosecutors have been asking for years is still unanswered. On what grounds? Through which procedure? Over whose signature? And if this picture seems strange to you, know this. Italy has been asking a similar question for more than 30 years about another boss and a villa that sat unsearched for days after his arrest. But that is a story for another night. Ecuador's question, that family's question, and no answer. There is only the result. Once outside, Rexhepi made the move that sums up his entire career one more time. He vanished. A forged Colombian passport, a new identity across the border, and, according to the allegations, front companies screening the trade. The escape artist had slipped through the system's fingers once again. Months passed, no trace. And then, in November of 2023, the chase ended in a city nobody expected. Not in Colombia, not in Dubai, not in Tirana, in Istanbul. Yes, the man the European press had crowned the Cocaine King was finally caught in Istanbul in an operation by Turkish police. The final escape route of a man who had slipped through the hands of 4 states for 27 years closed in this city with handcuffs. And from there, the final note was added to Albania's famous file. Rexhepi was extradited from Turkey to Albania. What awaits him? The 25-year sentence handed down in absentia and new cases to be added on top of it. But now, all of Europe is asking the same question, because the one constant truth of this man's career is this: to this day, no cell has ever held him. For Albania's prison system, this case is more than the serving of a sentence, it is a test of the state. The man who left Italy on bedsheets, Belgium over a fence, and Ecuador with a signature, now sits in a cell in his own country, and the whole continent is waiting for the same thing. The next time that door opens. Go back to Ecuador. After Rexhepi was caught in Istanbul, did Guayaquil calm down? Remember when that studio raid happened, January 2024, just weeks after Rexhepi's capture? The state declared war, the army moved into the streets, operation after operation hit the prisons. And in March of 2025, in a single day, 22 people lost their lives in gang clashes in Guayaquil. The war didn't end, the sides just got more crowded. And Kompania Bello? Not long after the big operation, a finding appeared in the reports of international researchers. Those who were caught, but the model and the route lived on. The traffic flowing from Guayaquil to Europe did not stop. According to the allegations, new links were added where the chain had emptied. The system no longer even needed its founder, like every well-built machine. And the banana ships? Even now, in these very minutes, as you watch this video, refrigerated containers are being loaded at the port of Guayaquil. At the end of part 1, I asked you a question: can this be stopped? This episode answered that question with one man's life. The state finally put the man who ran a continent from a cell into a cell in his own country. One more name dropped from the files, one more photograph moved to the archive. The dollar is still the dollar, the ports are still crowded, and Europe, every single night, keeps paying for the most expensive powder in the world. As long as the demand lives, the route lives. As long as the route lives, someone steps up to run it. Men fall, routes remain. The endless night never ends. Watch the shadows. Good night. This has been Endless Night Files.